Nowhere to Hide. This being an election year, we're going to see a lot of examples of politicians who will say anything in order to get elected and do anything in order to stay in power. In other words, they're very good at portraying a certain image. In fact, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but the whole point here is there's a big difference between style and substance, and we want to stick with the substance. I'll tell you more about it coming up.
Press club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. You probably could tell it's election season as you drive around Idaho. You're seeing a lot of signs and billboards going up. And I have to ask, have you ever seen more cowboy hats or more people trying to portray that rugged Western cowboy image? I've been in Idaho for 95 generations. And I understand, look, they're just trying to connect with that image of what makes a good, solid Idaho politician. But it's just that. It's an image for many of them. And they will play this role long enough to get elected and then go back to governing like some California beach bum who just, has never met a bill that they wouldn't approve where it comes to more spending or more government intrusion in your lives. So the difficulty for us as voters is to be very certain what's style and what is substance. Now, one of the best ways to do this is to start crunching the numbers. And this is where you have some very key allies in that fight. The Idaho Freedom Foundation being one of them. I want to share with you some excerpts from a commentary by Niklas from the Idaho Freedom Foundation. Niklas has offered, I think, some terrific insights into one of the big victories from this last legislative session. This is Niklas Kleinworth. And he points out here, look, Idaho's budget reform, which, by the way, it was pushed back against by those image-conscious politicians who don't really want to walk the walk. But it still was passed, which was a victory in and of itself. But it hasn't saved much taxpayer money yet. And here Niklas explains exactly why that's the case. So let's walk through this quickly. He says, fiscal conservatives secured a major victory when lawmakers voted to split budget requests for each state agency into two bills. One that maintains the existing budget, the second that considers budget increases. That's a pretty smart way to approach this. But even with this reform, taxpayers are still on the hook for this year's $13.9 billion spending spree. Now, I know it only sounds like, well, it's just money. It's just numbers we're throwing around out there. But you have to remember, the state itself does not create money. It does not create value. It can only take from those who've actually labored and worked and done something to create that value. It can only take a portion from them in the form of taxes. Now, if that sounds anti-tax, well, so be it. But I think we all should have the attitude of we shouldn't be paying a dime more in taxes than is absolutely necessary. And that's the difference between how politicians think and taxpayers think. Niklas says, recent budget numbers show how Idaho still has a very real spending problem, even though the welcome change to budgeting was not likely to bring immediate relief. Instead, this reform plays the long game, leveraging the increased transparency it provides to both lawmakers as well as their constituents, because now you can see who's voting for spending more of that hard-earned taxpayer money versus who is being careful about it. He says Idaho received accolades from across the nation for its move toward more fiscally conservative budgeting. And this new process separates the funding necessary to maintain basic operations within an agency from any increases the agency requests. These two components are considered in separate pieces of legislation, and that's considered to be more scrupulous when voting or allowing lawmakers to be more scrupulous when voting for increases. In other words, they have to justify it, not just to their colleagues, but also to those who elect them. This ends the all or nothing approach to budgeting, refocusing the debate on government bloat and increases. So yes, this was a huge victory for the conservative side. Now, establishment figureheads in the legislature who favor big spending opposed this overhaul to the budget process. You could probably imagine why. They don't like this kind of transparency. Several Republicans on the Joint Finance Appropriations, or JFAC, committee attempted to override the new process. These 12 lawmakers joined with Democrats to pass their own appropriations bills under something resembling the old process. Well, after weeks of deliberation and maneuvering, conservatives prevailed. The maintenance bills passed in the House of Representatives in their original form, which solidifies the new process. Niklas tells us lawmakers were more likely to vote against budget bills this year than in years past. Now, this is where we can see that it actually is getting results, even if it does seem slow at the beginning. As recently as 2019, he tells us as many as 55 and 89% of budget bills received 5 or fewer nay votes in the House and Senate, respectively. In other words, it was just easier to just rubber stamp it. Well, we got to get that money to the people who need it. Whatever else is in there is in there. We just have to do it. But this year, by splitting those up into what is necessary versus what is being asked for as an increase, those numbers dropped to 21% in the House and 33% in the Senate. That's a pretty noticeable bit of a decrease in terms of how many people were willing to just rubber stamp those. This increased tendency to vote against new spending gave fiscal conservatives some significant budget victories. Nicholas says, until this legislative session, the Senate hasn't killed a budget on the floor in years. This year, however, several bills returned to committee for cuts or adjustments, leading to the removal of new welfare programs and killing exorbitant wage increases in the judicial branch. Now, these are good changes, but one important victory is missing, and that is reduced spending. Nicholas tells us this year's appropriation is just 0.3% more than last year's. So now some lawmakers are celebrating that fact, but these numbers don't tell the whole story. The budget that Idaho will have to start in 2025, known as original appropriations, will still be 48% higher than the budget it had going into fiscal year 2021. I know everything's got more expensive, but remember, the state doesn't create that money. It has to take it from people who actually worked for it, which means those people now have less to work with in terms of meeting their needs, paying their bills, keeping a roof over their heads, and food on their tables. Very important to keep in mind. Though it looks as though the budget barely increases in the 2025 fiscal year, Nicholas says this is merely a mirage. Instead, reductions in spending from temporary federal pandemic relief funds are being offset by increases in spending from permanent state revenues. So for every dollar in reduced federal spending, legislators increased spending from state sources by $1.08. That shift amounts to more than $400 million. Okay, I don't care if you J.R. Simplot, that is not chump change. So why did the new process fail to curb growth in spending? Nicholas tells us one reason is it's common for legislators to defer to the recommendation of the committee when they're deciding how to vote on an issue. This is a common political shortcut used to avoid grappling with the complexities of a topic, and the state budget is no exception. It also allows them some plausible deniability if there's something in that budget that, well, that was something that was decided in committee. I really had no control over it, but we want transparency. Legislators who defer to committees grant a massive amount of undue power to the big spenders who hold a supermajority on the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee. Now, Nicholas says, remember that these are also the very legislators who tried to subvert the new process from the start. So it's unreasonable then to expect conservative budgets to come out of this committee regardless of any change to the budget making procedure. A very good point. And something more that you'll want to keep in mind is that the true merits of the new process rest in its transparency. Lawmakers get a better view of what is bureaucratic excess. Constituents now get to see how their lawmakers voted to increase spending. And as growth becomes more visible to the legislature and the public, the pressure to curb that excessive spending will increase. Hiding permanent budget growth beneath the ceiling created by temporary funding will not work for long. And as the burden of state government shifts back to Idahoans, in other words, those federal funds are finally slowing down to a trickle, it will be increasingly difficult to hide spending increases in a shell game. But he says this all takes time. Now, again, for people who think that the state is the answer to every question or every problem that comes up in life, why, this is a terrible thing. How can we do things without that money? But again, I remind you that money comes from people who actually had to work and provide create some sort of value in order to earn it. The state can't create that value, can only take it from the people who actually put in the work. Now, maybe you're okay with that. And if you want to pay more than your taxes, hey, please be my guest. But again, there are a lot of Idahoans who are struggling right now just to make ends meet. And this is not a time for politicians to be feeling, particularly free spending in how they go about spending the taxpayers' money. Now, this is going to be playing out also in terms of the election, both in May 21st as well as our general election coming up in November. And one of the things that we are seeing is that there are a lot of people who will put on that style of, well, we're Republicans, we're Main Street Republicans, we're common sense Republicans. They have all these little qualifiers to make sure that we're a Republican, but is it just a facade that they're putting on, a style that they're affecting, or is there real substance to it? I found a particularly enlightening tweet that was sent out that points to Northern Idaho as a great place to look for an example of how this game is played, and it is being played to the hilt in Northern Idaho. Tosh Landquist says, I was really trying to steer clear of politics this year. It's been my experience that many people involved with candidates are less than admirable, especially those of the left. They believe that labeling everyone as racists, extremists, or white nationalists is their trump card. Well, lately, people in North Idaho have been labeled rednecks, white trash, hillbillies, extremists, white nationalists, etc. By the way, still waiting on some proof for that race hoax with the University of Utah women's basketball team. What's that I hear? Oh, it's crickets? All right. We'll continue waiting. It's been a while, though. Tosh Landquist says, look, a lot of this labeling has come from people affiliated with the North Idaho Republicans. I'm sorry, that requires air quotes. North Idaho Republicans. They claim they're tired of the drama, but they are the people creating the drama. And if you research many of their committeeman recommendations, these are people that call Christians extremists, hate mongers, etc. They bent the term conservative to equal the support of mask and vaccine mandates, transgenderism, gun control, etc. Again, hiding behind some label like it's common sense. This is what everybody wants. But they're not upholding conservative values. It's a style that they've affected. And here the author just says, look, folks, these people are lying to you. They're trying to trick you by claiming to be conservative Republicans. They are not conservative. They are extreme progressives. In any other state where Democrats had a chance at winning, most of these North Idaho Republicans would be extreme left Democrats. So what this means for people like you and me, for voters who want to get out there and exercise our franchise responsibly, we can't take candidates at face value. You've got to be willing. This is not a time to sit back and just outsource. Well, somebody will drop a voter guide for me and tell me which way to vote. You need to be clear on what your principles are, what you're willing to support, and what you aren't. And that means you've got to be willing to look at the actions that would indicate what a person's principles are versus their words, which will always agree with whatever it is they think can get you to vote for them. Again, politicians will say anything in order to get elected, and they'll do anything in order to stay in power. That's a pretty amoral way to approach life, but it's what they do. And most of them are very good at it, at least the ones who have been in the game for any length of time. So look at their actions, vet their actions against the principles that you hold most important, and most importantly, don't sit out this one. Don't sit on the sidelines. There's some serious gamesmanship going on by people pretending and affecting that style of, well, of course, I'm a Republican conservative, when really it's the furthest thing from their mind. They want to get their hands on power so that they can consolidate that power and essentially insert more government and more costs into our lives with the expectation that at some point we're going to thank them for it. But if you've done your homework, you're not going to thank them. And that's not a bad thing. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Press Clever Bias All Media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
Indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is